Imagine standing on a battlefield in the 16th century. Across the dusty plain, sunlight glints off the curved blade of a warrior sword. It isn't straight like a European longsword, and it isn't heavy like a two-handed claymore. It's elegant, deadly, and most importantly, flexible. This is not just any sword. This is a kilij, the legendary curved blade of the Ottoman Empire. And believe it or not, it could slice clean through armor and still bounce back to its original shape. No electricity, no factories, just fire, hammer, and centuries of knowledge. In this video, we're diving into what made Ottoman swords so legendary and whether they were actually stronger than modern steel. And you might be surprised to find out they were doing things 500 years ago that modern blacksmiths are still trying to replicate. But before we unsheath the secrets, don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy uncovering forgotten survival and craftsmanship skills from the past. Alright, let's get to the edge of history, literally. The first thing we have to understand is that Ottoman swords weren't just weapons. They were status symbols, heirlooms, and works of art. A sword wasn't simply something you used in battle. It was something you earned, something you carried for life, something you passed down to your son. And its quality reflected not only your skill as a warrior, but the mastery of the craftsman who forged it. One of the most iconic types of Ottoman sword was the kilij, a single-edged, slightly curved blade designed for slashing rather than stabbing. This curve wasn't just for show. It allowed for faster, more efficient strikes on horseback. In a cavalry-heavy military like the Ottomans, that mattered a lot. But what really made these swords special was the metal. More specifically, the type of steel. Many of these blades were made from a legendary material known as wootz steel. This steel wasn't native to the Ottoman lands. It came from India and Persia, and the Ottomans knew it was valuable. Wootz was known for creating a blade that was incredibly hard, but also flexible, two qualities that are usually opposites. The secret? A very specific mixture of iron and carbon, slow cooling, and a forging process that preserved microscopic carbides in a patterned structure. These patterns gave wootz steel blades their signature Damascus look, wavy, watery lines that shimmered in the light. Now here's where it gets really wild. Modern metallurgists have analyzed ancient wootz blades under microscopes and found structures that they call nanowires, carbon nanotubes, formed naturally through the forging process. These aren't things you can just whip up in your garage. They're incredibly difficult to replicate today. So, yes, in some ways, ancient blacksmiths were creating materials that rival modern science. And they were doing it all without electricity, without modern thermometers, without industrial furnaces, just charcoal, bellows, intuition, and a deep relationship with fire and metal. The smiths would read the color of the glowing steel. They'd listen to the tone of the hammer strikes. They'd feel the resistance of the metal on the anvil. That's a kind of knowledge we've almost lost. But let's say you want to try this yourself. Can you? Well, not exactly the same way, unless you want to spend years becoming a bladesmith. But you can try modern adaptations. For example, using recycled leaf springs from old vehicles is a common method among DIY sword makers. Leaf spring steel is tough, flexible, and already shaped in a curve. With some patience, a propane forge, and a few basic tools, you can actually hand forge a short blade at home. It's not a kilij, but it's a start. And when you shape that first blade with your own hands, you suddenly start appreciating what those Ottoman masters were doing. And you might even end up saving a few bucks if you're into homestead tools or survival blades. Let's not forget the handles and scabbards. Ottoman swords weren't just strong, they were beautiful. Handles were often made of bone, horn, or wood, and inlaid with silver or mother of pearl. Scabbards were sometimes covered in velvet or embroidered fabric. These weren't mass-produced items, they were tailored to the warrior. Think of it as the iPhone case of the 1500s, but made by a master craftsman. And now the big question, were they better than modern steel? That depends on what you mean by better. In terms of industrial production, modern steel is more consistent. We can make 1,000 exact copies of a blade in a factory with laser precision. But in terms of quality per piece, it's not that simple. A properly forged Ottoman blade, made from high-quality steel and tempered by a master, could outperform many mass-produced modern swords. In fact, in controlled cutting tests, some surviving Ottoman swords have performed better than 20th century military sabers. That's not just nostalgia, it's metallurgy. Let me give you a concrete example. The famous 17th century Ottoman swordsmith Ahmed Tekelu made a kilij that could slice through iron helmets and bounce back. That sword was tested centuries later, and it still held up. Try doing that with a mall-bought replica. So what made it all possible? First, the knowledge passed down through generations of masters and apprentices. Second, access to superior raw materials like imported wootz. And third, the fact that they weren't rushing. A master might take weeks, even months, to finish one sword. It wasn't about mass production. It was about pride. Now let's compare this to today. Most of us don't even own a real knife sharpener, let alone know how to forge a blade. But imagine if you did. Imagine learning to shape metal, control heat, and create something that would last longer than your car. Imagine passing that skill down. That's not just survival, that's legacy. And honestly, that's what this whole channel is about. Reclaiming forgotten skills, learning from the past, asking, could I do this at home? Could I build something, fix something, defend something, without electricity, without modern tools, just like my ancestors? If this question excites you, then like this video and subscribe right now. I promise what's coming next is even more hands-on. Now, let's go deeper for a moment, the spiritual side. In Ottoman culture, swords weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of justice, honor, even divine will. Many blades were inscribed with Quranic verses or prayers. Some were even blessed before battle. You weren't just carrying a weapon, you were carrying a belief. That's why even centuries later, people collect these swords not just as artifacts, but as symbols. So here's your challenge. Could you make your own blade today? Maybe not with wootz steel or inlaid silver, but could you take something forgotten, like an old file, a piece of scrap metal, and shape it into something useful, even beautiful? You'd be surprised how far you can go with just a hammer, a file, and fire. There are entire online communities of DIY bladesmiths doing just that. And they're not just hobbyists, they're preserving a tradition. And maybe that's the biggest lesson here. The strength of the Ottoman sword wasn't just in the steel. It was in the story, the hands that made it, the lives it protected, the knowledge it carried forward. All right, now it's your turn. Tell me in the comments, would you ever try making your own blade? Have you ever held a real Ottoman sword or seen one in a museum? What surprised you most about what you learned today? And one last time, if this video gave you something to think about, if it made you wonder how much we've forgotten, hit that like button and subscribe. We're not just studying history here, we're practicing it, one ancient technique at a time. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and maybe stay away from dull factory steel.